Wrongfully convicted and thrown behind bars, a black former soldier finds himself trapped in a dangerous prison where every day is a fight for survival. Targeted by a ruthless gang ordered to take him out, he must navigate a world of violence and corruption, staying one step ahead of his enemies. With cold precision, he fights back while uncovering the truth behind. Can he reclaim his freedom and take down those who put him here? Find out in this gripping story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support us. The clang of the prison gates echoed like a death knell as Paul Ghost Carter stepped into Blackridge prison, the air thick with sweat, rust, and unspoken violence. The moment he crossed the threshold, he knew he wasn't just walking into a prison, he was stepping onto a battlefield. The guards barely spared him a glance, their expressions unreadable, detached. They didn't need to intimidate him. The walls would do that for them. Paul had been in war zones before. He is not an ordinary soldier. He is a living legend, a Delta Force commander respected by everyone and envied by many. He had moved through the heat of battle, dodging sniper fire, watching the world through the scope of his rifle, calculating every move with precision. But this was different. There was no mission here, no team watching his back, just him, the concrete walls, and the predators lurking in the shadows, waiting to test the new arrival. As he walked through the processing area, the metal cuffs around his wrists bit into his skin. The correctional officers were efficient, stripping him of everything he once was. His name was reduced to a number, his uniform swapped for an orange jumpsuit. His past meant nothing here. To them, he was just another inmate, another body added to the system. When they shoved a tattered roll of sheets and a thin mattress into his arms, he barely reacted. The real test was waiting for him on the other side of the heavy iron doors leading into general population. As the doors creaked open, a wave of noise hit him like a pressure wave from an explosion. Hundreds of men filled the tiered walkways and tables, some laughing, others watching, always watching. Paul walked through the cell block, keeping his steps measured, his breathing even. His military training had conditioned him to read body language, and what he saw confirmed what he already knew. Blackridge wasn't just a prison. It was a jungle. The blood serpents were the apex predators here, their red snake tattoos marking their territory. Some were gathered by the weight benches, their muscles coiled with tension, while others occupied a set of tables in the mess hall, their voices low, but their eyes sharp. He felt their gaze settle on him like a pack of wolves spotting a lone deer. Darius King Rowe was easy to spot. He sat in the center of it all, legs stretched out, arms draped over the back of the bench like he owned the place. He didn't need to make the first move. That wasn't how men like him operated. He let his pack do the circling first. Paul kept walking, ignoring the low murmurs, the subtle gestures in his direction. He had seen this play before. They weren't sure what he was yet, a threat, an asset, or prey. That meant they would test him, probe his weaknesses. As he reached his cell, the steel door sliding shut behind him, he took his first real breath. Solitude. It wouldn't last long, but it was something. The cell was barely large enough to stretch his arms, the walls marred with graffiti, the stink of old sweat and desperation lingering in the air. He set his mattress down on the metal cot, its thin frame creaking beneath the weight of his presence. His mind drifted to the trial, the betrayal, the lie that put him here. They had framed him too well. The evidence was neat, too clean, and the people who mattered had been paid off or silenced. Someone powerful wanted him buried. Not just behind bars, dead. A voice interrupted his thoughts. New fish, a deep, gravelly voice drawled from the bars outside his cell. Paul turned his head slightly, meeting the gaze of Mac Old Man Lewis, a wiry, sharp-eyed inmate with streaks of gray in his beard. "Don't talk much, do you?" Mac mused, leaning against the bars. Paul said nothing. Silence was a weapon, just like any other. Mac chuckled. "Smart. This place'll eat you alive if you run your mouth too much." His tone shifted just slightly. "You got eyes on you, Ghost. Blood serpents don't like new faces, especially ones that don't bow their heads." Paul's eyes didn't waver. "I don't bow." Mac smirked. "Yeah, figured. That's going to be a problem." Before Paul could respond, a loud buzzer blared through the block, signaling the next movement period. His solitude was over. He pushed off the cot, stepping back out into the open yard. The sky overhead was a dull, washed-out blue, the kind that offered no real warmth. The yard was divided, territories carved out in invisible lines, and Paul knew better than to cross them. He wasn't here to make friends. He wasn't here to join a crew. He was here to survive. But survival was about to get a whole lot harder. Across the yard, Darius Rowe finally made his move. He didn't come alone. His crew flanked him, spreading out, their presence turning the atmosphere electric. Conversations slowed, heads turned. Paul stayed still, waiting. Darius stopped a few feet away, studying him. Then that slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Ghost, huh?" Darius mused. "That what they called you in the military?" Paul didn't answer. Darius chuckled, glancing at his men. "You got the look. That 1,000-yard stare. I've seen it before." His voice lowered, turning almost amused. "Problem is, ghosts don't last long in a place like this." Paul's gaze remained steady. "That's supposed to scare me?" Darius's smile didn't waver, but the challenge in his eyes darkened. "Nah, it's a warning." Paul could feel the energy shifting. They were testing him. Darius stepped closer, just within reach. "Thing is, in here you either run with the pack or you get torn apart." Paul exhaled slowly, already knowing how this would play out. They wanted him to react, to lash out first, give them an excuse. But he wouldn't play their game. Instead, he just smiled, a slow, deliberate, knowing smile. "Then I guess we'll see who gets torn apart first," he said, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut. A flicker of something passed through Darius's eyes. Amusement, respect, and something else, danger. Then he stepped back, nodding slightly, the grin returning. "See you around, Ghost." As they walked away, Paul didn't relax. He could feel it in his bones. This was just the beginning. The hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Paul Ghost Carter sat in the visitation room, his broad shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched tight. The reinforced glass in front of him reflected his own image back at him, a man stripped of everything, yet still holding on to the one thing they couldn't take, his will. His eyes flicked to the door just as it swung open, revealing Samantha Carter, his lawyer, the only person still fighting for him beyond these prison walls. She moved with purpose, her sharp, analytical gaze scanning him as she sat down across from him, her fingers gripping a notepad with scribbled notes. "Paul," she said, her voice measured, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of urgency beneath it. He gave her a small nod. "Samantha." Her eyes searched his face, noting the subtle tension in his expression, the tightness in his shoulders. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been pulling at every loose thread I can find. The case against you is full of holes. Problem is, someone's working hard to keep them covered." She flipped a page in her notepad, tapping a section with the tip of her pen. "The main witness against you. He's disappeared, vanished off the grid. That's not a coincidence." Paul exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against the metal table. "So, they're tying up loose ends." "Exactly," Samantha said, her voice tightening. "And it's not just the witness. The forensic report on the so-called evidence they used to convict you. There are inconsistencies, files missing, timestamps that don't match. Someone doctored the records, but without solid proof, we don't have enough to get you out." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "That's why I need you to tell me what's happening inside here. Are they coming after you?" Paul's gaze flickered, a subtle movement she caught immediately. He had never been one to complain, never been one to show weakness, but she knew him well enough to see through the silence. He didn't answer right away, instead letting his fingers tighten around the edge of the table. Then, finally, he spoke. "They're watching me," he admitted, his voice low, steady. "The blood serpents, they've marked me, but they haven't made a move yet. Not directly, just circling, testing." Samantha's expression darkened. "That's not good." "No, it's not," Paul agreed. "And the guards, some of them are in on it. I don't know how deep it goes, but I see the way they look at me, like they already know how this ends." She swallowed hard, her grip tightening around the pen. "I've been looking into the warden, James Holloway," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "His financial records don't add up. Money's been moving through his accounts, big sums coming from offshore companies. He's dirty, Paul. And if he's part of this, Then your situation is worse than we thought. Paul's jaw flexed, his mind already piecing things together. He had suspected as much. The way the guards acted, the way Darius Rowe had spoken to him like he was already a dead man, it made sense now. This wasn't just about prison politics. Someone outside these walls wanted him gone, and Holloway was playing his part. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. How much time do you need? Samantha hesitated, her fingers gripping the notepad tightly. A few weeks. Maybe less if I can dig up something solid. But Paul, she trailed off, her eyes hardening. You have to hold on. You can't give them an excuse to take you out before I get you out. Paul let out a slow breath, his fingers pressing against the table. That's not up to me, Sam, he said, his voice carrying a weight she recognized all too well. They're going to come, whether I fight or not. And when they do, his eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. I'm not going down easy. Samantha's throat tightened. She had seen him in uniform, had seen him return from missions with that same hardened resolve in his eyes. But this wasn't a battlefield, it was a cage. And even warriors could fall when the walls closed in. The guard standing by the door shifted, clearing his throat. Time's up. Samantha exhaled sharply, her hands balling into fists before she forced herself to relax. She gave Paul one last look, one filled with determination, with promise. I'll find the truth, she said firmly. Just stay alive. Paul gave her a slight nod, then rose from his seat. He didn't look back as the guard led him away. He couldn't afford to. The moment he stepped back into Gen Pop, he could feel the shift. The eyes on him, the weight of something inevitable pressing down. As he walked past the rows of cells, he spotted Mac Old Man Lewis leaning against the bars of his cell, watching him with a knowing look. You get anything good from that lawyer of yours? Mac asked, his voice carrying just enough amusement to let Paul know he had been paying attention. Enough, Paul replied. Mac exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Then you better start thinking about how you're going to make it through the next few weeks. Ghost. Because Rowe and his boys? They ain't going to wait that long. Paul didn't respond, but he didn't have to. He already knew. As he reached his cell, the metal door sliding shut behind him, he finally allowed himself a moment to think. He had two problems now, one on the outside, one on the inside. On the outside, Samantha was racing against time, trying to uncover the truth before it was buried for good. On the inside? The blood serpents were done waiting. And the next time Rowe approached him, it wouldn't just be words. Paul sat on the edge of his cot, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rough fabric of his jumpsuit. His mind was already moving ahead, calculating, planning. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying ahead. Because in Blackridge, the moment you fell behind, you never got back up. The cold fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Paul Ghost Carter sat at the edge of his metal cot, his fingers loosely intertwined, his knuckles white. His body was still, his breathing controlled, but his mind was racing. The encounter in the yard had confirmed what he already knew: blood serpents were coming for him. Darius Rowe wasn't the type to issue empty threats. No, he was the kind that liked to play with his prey before delivering the final blow. Paul had seen his kind before, on battlefields far from here, men who thrived on power and control, men who built their kingdoms on fear. But Paul wasn't prey. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for just a moment. He thought about the trial, the cold, sterile courtroom, the way the prosecutor had painted him as a traitor, a murderer. The evidence had been stacked against him, too perfect, too convenient. And now here he was, locked away, surrounded by men who had every reason to want him dead. Someone wanted him erased, and the blood serpents were just the tool to get the job done. A sound snapped him back to the present. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, stopping outside his cell. He opened his eyes, already knowing who it was. Mac Old Man Lewis stood just beyond the bars, arms crossed over his wiry frame, his expression unreadable. You got a problem, Ghost, Mac muttered. They don't test a man like you unless they're already planning to bury him. Paul didn't react. He just looked at the old inmate, waiting for him to continue. Mac sighed, rubbing a hand over his gray-streaked beard. Rowe's got a system. First they watch. Then they poke. See how you react. And if you don't break, they hit. hard. Paul nodded slightly. He had already figured that out. How long do I have? Mac leaned against the bars, his voice dropping lower. Not long. A day, maybe 2. But it won't be in the yard. Too many eyes. Too many guards. They'll wait until you're somewhere quieter. Paul already knew where. The showers. It made sense. No cameras. No witnesses willing to talk. Just him, the steam, and however many blood serpents Darius decided to send. He needed to be ready. Max studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. You got a plan? Paul's jaw tightened, working on it. Max snorted. You better work fast. Then, with a slight nod, he disappeared down the tier, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts. He sat back, mind turning over the situation. He had been trained for this. Anticipate. Adapt. Act. He couldn't afford to wait for them to make their move. He needed an advantage. His eyes scanned the small, grimy cell. There was nothing useful, just the thin mattress, the metal frame, the dull, rusted sink. But he didn't need much. His hands had done worse with less. Paul pulled his toothbrush from the small shelf, running his thumb over the handle. It wasn't a weapon yet, but it would be. He moved quickly, snapping the bristles off and gripping the plastic end. With slow, deliberate strokes, he began grinding it against the concrete floor, shaping the end to a sharp, lethal point. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible beneath the hume of the prison, but Paul worked fast, his muscles tense, his focus absolute. By the time he was done, the plastic had taken the shape he needed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He tucked the shiv beneath his mattress, pressing it deep into the fabric. Now, he waited. The next day moved like a slow, ticking clock, every minute stretching into eternity. The blood serpents didn't make a move in the yard, didn't approach him in the mess hall. They were waiting for the right moment, just like he was. Then, the moment arrived. The buzzer rang, signaling shower time. Paul didn't hesitate. He moved with the other inmates, keeping his posture loose, relaxed. He couldn't let them know he was expecting it. The shower room was humid, steam curling in thick tendrils from the rusted pipes overhead. Water dripped from cracked tiles, the scent of mildew clinging to the air. Paul stepped under the spray, his back never fully turned to the room, his senses on high alert. Then he heard it. The door closing. The shift in energy. They were here. Darius Rowe's men moved like wolves, 6 of them, spreading out, their eyes glinting with cruel anticipation. The leader of this little pack was a stocky, tattooed man with a scar running from his temple down to his jaw. He cracked his knuckles, smirking. Time's up, Ghost. Paul didn't answer. He just took a slow step back, his feet sliding over wet tile, his hands loose, ready. The first one moved fast, coming in with a wide swing, expecting Paul to stumble. Paul dodged, his movements fluid, then slammed his fist into the man's throat. A wet gurgle. A stumble. 1 down. The second was smarter, coming low, trying to grab Paul's legs. Paul twisted, driving his elbow into the side of the man's skull, sending him sprawling against the tile. A blade flashed. Someone had a shiv. Paul barely managed to sidestep, but the blade nicked his ribs, a hot line of pain burning through his side. He gritted his teeth, ignoring it, then grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisting until he heard the pop of a dislocated joint. The shiv clattered to the floor, sliding across the wet tiles. 3 left. The scarred leader lunged. Paul braced himself, redirecting the man's momentum, slamming him into the wall. The impact echoed, a dull, sickening thud. Paul didn't give him time to recover. He drove his knee up hard. The leader collapsed, wheezing. The last 2 hesitated. Paul picked up the fallen shiv, twirling it once in his fingers. His breathing steady, his muscles coiled. The message was clear. They weren't hunting him. He was hunting them. One of them bolted, scrambling for the exit. The other, younger, less experienced, just stood frozen, his hands shaking. Paul didn't move, didn't attack. He just held the shiv, letting the silence stretch. Then, finally, the last man turned and ran. Paul exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling the sting of the cut on his ribs. It wasn't deep, he had survived. But this wasn't over. As he stood there, catching his breath, the door to the shower swung open. A CO stepped inside. He was tall, broad, his face unreadable. Travis Rayner, one of Holloway's men. His gaze swept over the scene, the bodies on the ground, the blood dripping from the cut on Paul's side. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a knowing smirk. "You sure know how to make a mess, Ghost." Paul said nothing. Rayner took a step forward, voice dropping low. "Warden's got an eye on you. So do a lot of people." He glanced at the men groaning on the floor. "You keep this up, you won't make it to the end of your sentence." Paul held his gaze, his expression cold. "I'm not planning to." Rayner studied him for a moment longer before nodding once. Then, without another word, he turned and left. Paul knew what this meant. Darius Rowe wouldn't let this go. And James Holloway was watching. The war had just begun. Paul Ghost Carter sat in his cell, his back pressed against the cold cinder block wall, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the thin bandage wrapped around his ribs. The cut from the shower fight wasn't deep, but it was enough to remind him that he was still alive. For now. The blood serpents had made their move, and they had failed. That wouldn't sit well with Darius Rowe. A man like Rowe didn't tolerate failure, not from his men and sure as hell not from his enemies. The next attack wouldn't be sloppy. It wouldn't be rushed. It would be calculated, designed to finish what they started. Paul knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Outside his cell, the block was alive with its usual chaos. Voices echoed, some laughing, some arguing, others whispering about what had happened in the showers. He knew the fight had already spread through Blackridge like wildfire. In prison, violence was currency, and Paul had just increased his value. Some would respect him now. Others would want to test him, and some, like Rowe, would be planning their revenge. He took a slow breath, forcing his body to relax, but his mind stayed sharp. He couldn't wait for the next hit to come. He needed to move first. The question was how. He had no allies, no weapons beyond the makeshift shiv he'd stashed under his mattress. But what he did have was his training, his instincts, and a growing understanding of the way Blackridge operated. The first rule of war was to gather intelligence, and Paul needed to know exactly who he was up against. A sharp rap on his cell bars made him glance up. Mac Old Man Lewis leaned against the frame, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something close to respect. "Hell of a show you put on in the showers," Mac muttered, his voice low, careful. "Didn't think you'd walk out to there in one piece." Paul shrugged. Neither did they. Mac smirked. "You're making enemies fast, Ghost. Blood serpents don't like to be embarrassed. You humiliated them. That means they're going to come at you harder." "I know," Paul said simply. Mac studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You need to get ahead of this. Rowe's not just some thug. He's got connections, inside and out. Word is, some of the guards are in his pocket. If you think you're just fighting inmates, you're wrong." Paul had already suspected as much. The way Rayner had looked at him in the showers, the way he'd smirked. There was more going on here than just a prison gang pissed off about a fight. Mac lowered his voice. "There's ways to fight back, but you can't do it alone. You need information. You need resources." He hesitated, then sighed. "I might be able to help with that." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Mac chuckled, shaking his head. "Because I don't like Rowe, and I don't like seeing good men get chewed up and spit out by this place." His smirk faded. "And because I owe someone like you." Paul didn't ask for details. Everyone in Blackridge had their own ghosts, their own debts. What mattered was that Mac was offering him a way forward. "What do you know?" Paul asked. Mac leaned in slightly. "Rowe's got a stash. Drugs, cash, weapons, you name it. He's got a system in place, ways to get things in and out of here without the guards looking too close. You want to hurt him. You hit his supply line." Paul nodded slowly. Cutting off a gang's resources was the fastest way to weaken them. "Where's he keeping it?" Mac's lips twitched into a grin. "That's the tricky part. He doesn't keep it in one place. He moves it. But there's one guy who knows where it all goes, a runner named Vito. Skinny bastard, always looking over his shoulder. If you get to him, you get to Rowe." Paul absorbed the information, already piecing together a plan. Where do I find him? Mac glanced toward the mess hall. He eats alone. Always on edge. If you push him the right way, he'll fold. Paul knew how to push men. He had interrogated people before, some in war zones, some in back rooms with nothing but time and pressure. Everyone had a breaking point. Mac stepped back, his voice dropping even lower. One more thing. Warden Holloway's got his hands in this too. The drugs, the fights, the whole damn system, it all benefits him. If you make too much noise, he'll notice. Paul's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. A place like Blackridge didn't run on accident. It ran on corruption. Mac nodded once, then walked away, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts. He sat back, rolling his shoulders, feeling the tension settle in his muscles. He had a target now, Vito. If he could get to him, he could cripple Rowe. But Mac was right, he had to be careful. He wasn't just up against a gang anymore. He was up against the entire system. The next day, during mealtime, Paul moved deliberately, scanning the room until he spotted Vito, sitting alone at a table near the far wall. The man was twitchy, hunched over his food, eating quickly, his eyes darting around like he expected someone to grab him at any second. Paul had seen that look before, the look of a man carrying secrets too heavy for his own good. Paul approached, his movements calm, measured. He didn't sit down right away. He just stood across from the table, watching. Vito swallowed hard, barely glancing up. "I don't want trouble," he muttered. Paul finally sat, leaning in slightly. "You already have trouble," he said quietly. "I'm just here to offer you a way out." Vito's hands clenched around his tray. "I don't know what you're talking about." Paul smirked slightly. "That's not true. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Rowe's stash. His supply line. You know where it is, don't you?" Vito's breath hitched. Look, man, I don't." Paul cut him off, his voice dropping lower. "You're nervous, Vito. I get it. But let me explain something to you. Right now, you've got two options. You keep your mouth shut, and when Rowe finds out I've been asking questions, he'll assume you talked anyway. He'll gut you just to make sure. Or you tell me what I need to know, and I make sure Rowe doesn't get that chance." Vito's hands trembled slightly. He glanced around the room, but no one was paying attention yet. Paul leaned back slightly, giving him space. Clocks ticking. Vito exhaled shakily. Then, finally, he nodded. "There's a stash. Inside the old laundry room. Back wall, behind the loose panel. It's where he keeps the real product before it moves out." His voice dropped lower. "But there's a problem. Guards patrol that hallway. If you get caught there, they won't ask questions. They'll just put you in the ground." Paul absorbed the information, his mind already shifting, planning. He had what he needed. Now, it was time to act. But as he stood to leave, Vito's voice stopped him. "You don't get it, man. This isn't just about Rowe. Holloway's got his own operation, bigger than just the serpents. If you start pulling at the wrong threads..." Paul turned slightly, meeting Vito's eyes. "Then I pull harder." And with that he walked away, already feeling the weight of the war ahead. The prison was a beast that never slept. It breathed in the whispers of the inmates, fed on violence, and exhaled corruption. Paul Ghost Carter had spent his entire life adapting to hostile environments, but Blackridge was different. There were no rules, no Geneva Conventions, no reinforcements coming to pull him out. Here, he was the mission. The objective was survival. And now, after gathering enough information to strike back, it was time to act. The old laundry room. That was where Darius Rowe hid his stash, drugs, cash, and whatever else he used to keep the blood serpents in power. But the real threat wasn't just Rowe. James Holloway had his hands in everything, controlling the flow of contraband, deciding who lived and who didn't. Paul had spent his time gathering intel, putting the pieces together. The warden wasn't just profiting from the gangs, he was orchestrating them. The fights, the hits, even the drug trade, it all fed back to Holloway. He let the gangs think they ran Blackridge, while he pulled the strings from his office, keeping the system just chaotic enough to stay in control. Paul had been a soldier long enough to recognize a war when he was in one. And now he was about to flip the battlefield. Night fell, But Blackridge never truly slept. Guards patrolled in slow, lazy rotations, and inmates either whispered in their cells or plotted in the yard. Paul moved with purpose, slipping through the corridors during a scheduled maintenance check, a blind spot in the cameras Mac had warned him about. He stayed low, his movements controlled, his breathing steady. Reaching the laundry room was easy. The hard part was getting inside. The door was old, reinforced steel, but Paul had studied the way the guards checked it. They never actually locked it, just bolted it shut from the outside. That meant it could be opened from within, and Paul knew exactly how. He moved quickly, fishing out a thin piece of metal, a bent strip from his own cot frame, filed down against the concrete of his cell over the past 2 days. He worked it into the bolt, feeling for the latch. The metal clicked, then gave way. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of old washing machines that hadn't run in years. Dust clung to the air. Against the back wall, hidden behind a stack of old, moldy sheets, was a loose metal panel, exactly where Vito had said it would be. Paul reached for it, pulling it free with slow, measured movements. Behind it was a duffel bag packed with cash, heroin, weapons, and a few handwritten ledgers that could bury Rowe and Holloway. But before he could move, he felt it. A presence. "You should have stayed in your cell, Ghost." Paul didn't turn immediately. He already knew the voice. Darius Rowe. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Rowe stood in the doorway, blocking the exit, flanked by 4 of his men. Each one had something, a shiv, a sharpened toothbrush, a metal pipe. They were here to end it. Paul's gaze flicked to Vito, standing just behind Rowe. His face was tight with fear. He hadn't ratted Paul out. Rowe had just been watching the whole time. The gang leader grinned. "You think you're smart, don't you? Digging around, playing detective." He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his knife glinting under the dim lights. "But you made a mistake. You should have killed me when you had the chance." Paul didn't hesitate. He moved first. He grabbed the duffel bag, swinging it hard. The weight of the cash and drugs sent the first serpent stumbling back, buying him a fraction of a second. Paul used it. He lunged, his fist colliding with the second man's throat, crushing his windpipe. Rowe was already moving, his knife flashing toward Paul's ribs. Paul twisted, the blade slicing the air just inches from his skin. He countered with a brutal elbow to Rowe's jaw, the impact cracking through the room. The third serpent swung with the pipe. Paul ducked, then drove a knee into the man's gut. The attacker folded, gasping. But the fourth was fast. He tackled Paul, slamming him against the metal dryers. The impact sent a dull shockwave through Paul's back, but he didn't stop. He twisted, grabbed the man's wrist, and snapped it backward with a sickening pop. Then it was just Rowe. The gang leader wiped blood from his lip, his eyes burning with fury. "You don't get it, do you?" He spat. "Even if you win, you lose. Holloway runs this place. The guards will find your body in here, and no one will give a damn." Paul exhaled slowly, his stance still firm. "Then I guess I better not die." Rowe roared and charged, his knife leading the way. Paul waited, let him come, then sidestepped at the last second. He caught Rowe's wrist, twisting it violently. The knife clattered to the floor. Paul didn't stop. He grabbed Rowe's head and slammed it against the nearest machine, once, twice, until the man collapsed, blood dripping from his temple. The room was silent. Paul took a step back, his breathing even, his knuckles bloody. Vito stared at him, wide-eyed. You just." Paul grabbed the duffel bag and turned to face him. "You have 2 options, Vito. Walk out of here and forget you saw this, or help me end this whole thing." Vito swallowed hard. Then, finally, he nodded. "I'm in." They moved quickly. Vito had access to the main admin block, a place where ledgers, visitor logs, and guard rotations were kept. Paul knew the real fight wasn't just against Rowe. It was against Holloway. Using the stolen ledgers, Paul slipped the information to Mac, who in turn had a guard, one not in Holloway's pocket, pass it to Samantha Carter. Within hours, the evidence was in the right hands. By sunrise, federal agents raided Blackridge. Paul watched from the yard as Holloway was led out in cuffs, his face twisted with rage. The corruption had been exposed, the blood serpents left leaderless. Rowe was still breathing, but he wouldn't be running anything anymore. Paul stood in front of the prison gates, the air outside feeling different, heavier. Samantha waited for him, a rare smirk on her face. "I told you I'd get you out," she said. He glanced at her, then back at the rising sun. "Yeah," he muttered, "but I had to clear the field first." She handed him a file. "You ready for the next part?" Paul flipped it open. Inside was a photo of the man who had framed him, a senator, powerful, untouchable. Or so he thought. Paul exhaled, feeling the weight of his past settle over his shoulders. He had been trained for war. Now, he was bringing it home. He shut the file, his jaw tight. Let's get to work. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.